Hello again. Today what I want to talk about is TMJ, which is temporomandibular joint disorder. Much easier to say TMJ. And I want to talk about the psycho-emotional root causes of TMJ. And for those of you who don't know, I've spent the last 16 years specializing in helping people identify and resolve the root stress emotional causes of physical symptoms. So this is a topic which really fascinates me, and whenever somebody says they have symptoms, especially chronic symptoms, and chronic means symptoms have been going on for 6 months or longer, whenever anybody says they have ongoing symptoms that they can't get rid of, I immediately in my mind think, okay, what's going on behind that? Because most physical symptoms have a metaphysical reason. So I saw this post today, somebody asking about TMJ, and I thought, right, that's what I'll talk about today. Now, many years ago, and this was before I knew what I understand now about illness, I had TMJ, and this was probably about 35 odd years ago, and I could hardly open my mouth and I could hardly eat, which probably wasn't a bad thing, but it did make it quite difficult to eat. So I was referred to a specialist. I think it was a dental specialist, I'm not sure, but I went to a specialist and he did his examination and said, well, the only thing that we can do is to operate. And I can't remember what he was suggesting he did, but he said this is the only solution. And remember, this is before I knew what I understand now about illness. I didn't have an awareness around the metaphysical reason for physical symptoms. All I knew was if you have a problem, you go to a doctor, you have surgery, you get medication. That was the only solution I knew. But something inside of me said, no, I really don't want to go that route. That just doesn't sound great at all, to have an invasive surgery which may or may not work, which will probably leave some scarring, and I decided not to do that even though I didn't have an answer. Now I can't actually remember, which is a bit frustrating, but I can't actually remember what I did at the time to help myself, but things did start to get better. And it may have coincided with the counselling that I started. So back at that time, I'd been diagnosed with clinical depression, and it got very severe. And it was a long journey to understand what is it that causes the depression and to get myself well. Won't go there today. But the reason I mention this now is that what I learned over time was that depression was the depressing, or is the depressing, of emotions. So a lot of people will think that depression is an emotion, but it's not. It's actually more the action of unconsciously depressing other emotions. And the types of emotions that we tend to depress are things like frustration, sadness, hurt. These are the core emotions that can lie underneath depression. And so in order to heal our depression, we need to identify and clear the underlying emotions. And this brings me back to TMJ. So if you think about your jaw and you ask yourself, when do I tend to clench my jaw? Or when does one tend to clench one's jaw? The answer is probably going to be something along the lines of, well, when I get frustrated. And that is very common for people to clench their jaw when they're feeling frustrated. And the reason they do that is because they're sort of holding their jaw and they're holding something in. And so one of the main core emotions which is related with TMJ is frustration and anger. And remember that, or you may not have seen the other videos, but I talked in another video about how anger is what I call a sweet or a lolly emotion, and anger is the protective emotion, the wrapper that wraps around the lolly inside the wrapper, and the emotion that is inside the lolly is usually something along the lines of hurt, maybe hurt, disappointment. There could also be fear. Fear is related to anger, but I'm not talking about that necessarily in this case. So TMJ is very, very related with the emotion of frustration and anger. So if we have TMJ, we need to ask ourselves, what am I feeling frustrated and angry about? What is unresolved in my life? And it could be something that is currently ongoing, and quite likely, but whatever it is that is currently ongoing is also very likely to be related to something in the past that is also unresolved, but we may not have a conscious awareness of that. And this is the really tricky thing about emotions. They're very, very sneaky indeed. We can be feeling emotions, in other words, emotions can be being generated from inside our body, and they're going on inside, but we are completely oblivious to the fact that that is happening. And one of the ways that we become aware of the fact that we have emotions trapped inside of us is when they start turning into symptoms, because eventually the stress and the emotions will build up to some physical symptoms, because that's how the body works. It's the way of getting our attention, because if it doesn't get our attention through the emotions by themselves or through the stress by itself, it has no alternative but to ramp it up and put it up from alert level 2 to 3. Shouldn't be talking about alert levels now in lockdown, should I? But anyway, it ramps it up to a higher alert level to get our attention. And when we start to experience symptoms, it becomes so uncomfortable and so inconvenient that we can no longer ignore it. But whenever we have symptoms, especially chronic symptoms, we need to look for the deeper reason. And when we identify what that deeper reason is and we resolve it, it's amazing, because the symptoms will just dissolve and disappear, because they don't need to be there anymore. They've done their job, and once they've done their job and we've taken notice and we've resolved whatever issues were hiding without us realizing it, then the body will just restore itself back to balance. So that is a little bit of information about TMJ. I do hope that if anybody has symptoms of TMJ, that they might like to check out this approach rather than going straight to some sort of medical procedure, because many medical procedures, even though some may very well be necessary, some may not be so necessary, and then we're still left with the underlying problem, which will then turn up in some other way. So I hope you're having a great day. See you again.